Imagine a room full of people, all dressed in their finest clothes. Candles are flickering. Someone is crying, not from sadness but from something harder to name. Two people stand at the front, hands joined, voices trembling as they speak words that have been spoken, in one form or another for thousands of years. We call it a wedding. We treat it as natural, as obvious, as simply what people do when they love each other. But stop for a moment. Why? Why did love, something felt so privately, so quietly inside the chest, ever need a ceremony? Why did it need witnesses and rules and documents stamped with official seals? When did humans decide that feeling something wasn't enough? To understand why marriage exists, we have to go back, far back, to a time before rings, before ceremonies, before love songs and flower arrangements. Back to when human life was simpler and far more dangerous. Early humans lived in small groups. They hunted together, slept close together, and depended on each other to survive. In that world, the biggest threats weren't broken hearts. They were starvation, violence, and the slow, quiet danger of being alone. And so the earliest human bonds were not built on romance. They were built on need. When two people, or two families, formed the lasting union, it wasn't primarily about feeling. It was about protection. A woman with a reliable partner had someone to help feed and defend her children. A man connected to another family had allies, people who would fight beside him, share food with him, support him when times were hard. The bond made both sides stronger. That was the point. In this way, the very first form of what we now call marriage was really a kind of agreement, not between two hearts, but between two groups of people. The individuals involved were almost secondary. What mattered was the connection between families, between clans, between tribes who needed each other to survive. Anthropologists who study early human societies have found evidence of this pattern across vastly different cultures, from ancient Mesopotamia to early communities in sub-Saharan Africa to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Separated by oceans and centuries, these groups independently arrived at similar arrangements, not because they shared a culture, but because they shared a problem. Life was uncertain, and a formal bond between families was one of the most reliable solutions humans found. There's something quietly humbling about that, my friends. We often imagine the ancient people were more primitive, less thoughtful, less feeling. But what they were doing was actually quite sophisticated. They were building systems of trust in a world that offered very little of it. Think about what it must have felt like. A young person, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, meeting the person their family had chosen for them, not with the expectation of passion, necessarily, but with something else, a shared understanding that this union served a purpose larger than either of them. That together, they were safer than apart. That together, their children had a better chance of surviving. In that context, the ceremony, whatever form it took, wasn't decoration. It was a declaration. A public announcement that this bond was real, recognized, and meant to last. Love in those early arrangements may or may not have followed. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it grew slowly, like a plant finding light through a narrow window. But it was never the foundation. It was, at best, a gift that came later. If people were lucky, the foundation was something far more practical and far more fragile than we might expect. Because the moment humans began to accumulate things, land, animals, grain, shelter, the stakes of that agreement became much, much higher. Around 10,000 years ago, something changed that would quietly reshape almost every aspect of human life. People stopped moving. They planted seeds, built permanent shelters, and began to stay in one place. We call it the agricultural revolution. But what it really was, at a human level, was the beginning of ownership. And ownership created a problem that no one had faced quite so sharply before. When people had nothing, there was little to argue about when they died. But now, suddenly, there was land. There were animals, tools, stored food, a house with walls and a roof. There was something to pass on. And that raised an urgent, uncomfortable question. Who does it go to? The answer that most early agricultural societies arrived at was simple, and yet enormously consequential. It goes to the children, the blood children, the ones who carry the family line forward. But here, my friends, is where things became complicated. Because in order to be certain that a child truly belonged to a man, that the inheritance would pass to his actual offspring, society needed to control something it had never tried to control before. It needed to control women. Marriage, in this period, transformed. It stopped being purely an alliance between families and became something more structural, a system, a legal and social framework designed to establish clearly and publicly who belonged to whom. Wives were bound to husbands. Husbands were bound to provide and protect, and the children born within that bond were considered legitimate, meaning they had rights, status, and a future. Children born outside of it often had none of those things. Some of the earliest written legal codes in human history reflect this shift with striking clarity. The Code of Hammurabi, written in ancient Babylon around 1754 BCE, contained detailed laws about marriage, divorce, and inheritance. It specified what a wife could own, what happened if she was unfaithful, and how property should be divided when a union ended. These were not love letters, they were contracts, and they revealed just how thoroughly marriage had become woven into the economics of civilization. Imagine a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, a man who had spent 30 years clearing land, digging irrigation channels, building a life from the soil. As he grew old, his deepest concern was not whether he had been happy. It was whether everything he had built would survive him. Marriage gave him a structure for that. A wife, a legitimate heir, a line of inheritance that society recognized and protected. The ceremony wasn't romantic. It was a legal act dressed in ritual clothing. And ritual, it turned out, was powerful. When something is performed publicly, when there are witnesses, when words are spoken aloud, when families gather, it becomes real in a way that private feelings never quite can. The ceremony created a shared memory, a moment that an entire community agreed had happened and meant something. That social agreement was, in many ways, the whole point, because a contract that no one remembers is no contract at all. But as marriage became more structured, more legal, more bound to property and power, something else began to happen, something quieter, something that wouldn't fully surface for centuries. The people inside the system began to feel its weight. For most of human history, marriage was not something you chose. It was something that happened to you. Your family decided, your village decided, your religion decided, the law decided. And the person whose life was most shaped by that decision, most constrained, most defined, most limited, was almost always the woman. This is the part of marriage's history that doesn't appear in the ceremonies. It doesn't show up in the flowers or the music or the carefully spoken vows, but it was always there, running quietly beneath the surface like a cold current under warm water. When marriage became a system, when it became tied to property and inheritance and social order, it needed someone to be managed within it. And across most cultures and most centuries, that someone was the wife. She moved into her husband's household. She took his name. Her children legally belonged to him. In many societies, she could not own land, could not sign a contract, could not leave without his permission. She entered the marriage as a person and, in the eyes of the law, became something closer to an extension of someone else. We should sit with that for a moment, not rush past it, because these were not women from a distant, abstract past. They were daughters who had grown up with their own thoughts, their own laughter, their own quiet sense of who they were. And then, often as teenagers, they were handed to a man they may have barely known, and the world told them this was simply the natural order of things, that this was what love looked like, that this was what life was for. Some found genuine warmth within those arrangements, real affection, real partnership, something that grew over years into something meaningful. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, and love can find its way into unexpected spaces. But others lived inside marriages that felt like closed rooms, functional perhaps, but airless, and they had no door to open. The hidden cost of formalizing love was this, that the formality served some people far more than others. The system was built to protect inheritance and ensure social order, and so, naturally, it protected those who stood to inherit and those who held social power. Everyone else, women, the poor, those whose love didn't fit the accepted shape, lived in the margins of a structure that was never really designed with them in mind. There is something deeply human about this contradiction. We built marriage to create stability, and we did, but stability for some often meant confinement for others. The same walls that kept the cold out also kept people in. For centuries, that tension remained mostly silent, not because people didn't feel it, but because feeling something and being able to change it are two very different things. Change, when it finally came slowly, unevenly, painfully, and it didn't announce itself as revolution. It arrived instead as a quiet, persistent question that one generation passed to the next. Does it have to be this way? The shift didn't happen overnight. It didn't arrive with a single law or a single moment or a single generation that suddenly decided things should be different. It crept forward slowly, across centuries, carried by small changes that accumulated almost invisibly into something transformative. But it did happen. In Europe during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church began insisting on something that, at the time, was quietly radical. Both parties in a marriage the Church declared needed to give their consent. Freely, without coercion. This was not yet about love, and it was not yet about equality. The Church had its own reasons, theological, institutional, for wanting marriage to be a sacred and voluntary act. But the idea it planted was a seed. The idea that a person's own voice had to be part of the arrangement. That seed grew slowly, very slowly, but it grew. By the 18th century, something else had begun to shift, particularly in Western Europe and the young nations of the Americas. Philosophers and writers were filling books and pamphlets with a dangerous new idea, that individuals had rights, that a person's happiness mattered, that life was not purely about duty to family, to class, to God, but also, perhaps, to oneself. These ideas moved through society the way weather moves, not touching every corner equally, but changing the atmosphere for everyone. And marriage began to change with it. For the first time in recorded history, in certain parts of the world, people began marrying more often for what they felt rather than what their families needed. Young people started choosing partners based on affection, on compatibility, on something that resembled what we would now recognize as love. It wasn't universal. It wasn't immediate. In many parts of the world, arranged marriages remained, and still remain, the norm. But the idea that emotional connection could be the primary reason to marry had entered the conversation. And once an idea like that enters, it rarely leaves. By the 20th century, the legal architecture of marriage was being rebuilt piece by piece. Women gained the right to own property, to sign contracts, to divorce, to work, to hold their own name. In many countries, laws that had once treated wives as legal dependents were quietly rewritten. The pace was uneven, faster in some places, heartbreakingly slow in others. But the direction, over time, was clear. Think about what this meant in practice. A woman in 1950, marrying in a small town, might still have felt enormous pressure from her family, her community, her church. Her choices were still narrow. But her grandmother had had almost no choices at all. And her granddaughter, just 2 generations later, might choose when to marry, whom to marry, or whether to marry at all. That distance, across 3 generations, represents one of the most profound shifts in the history of human relationships. Not announced loudly, not always celebrated, but real. Marriage had entered the modern world. And in doing so, it had become something its earliest architects would barely have recognized. It had become, at least an aspiration, a choice. And so we arrive at the question that has been waiting quietly beneath everything we've explored. If marriage is no longer required for survival, no longer the only path to social acceptance, no longer the legal container that holds a woman's rights or a family's inheritance, if all of that has changed, or is changing, then what is it now? What does it mean when 2 people still choose to stand in a room full of people they love, hands joined, voices trembling, and say, "I choose you," publicly, officially, in front of everyone? Why, when the necessity has faded, does the ceremony remain? Perhaps because humans have always needed more than just feeling. We are strange creatures, my friends. We feel things so privately, so deeply, so far below the surface of what we can easily say. And yet, we are not satisfied to keep those feelings only for ourselves. We want them witnessed. We want them spoken aloud. We want the people around us to know, this matters, this is real, this is not something I am keeping quiet. There is something in the ceremony, in the ritual, in the public act of choosing, that transforms the feeling into a fact. Not a legal fact necessarily, not a fact that needs a document to exist, but a human fact, the kind that lives in shared memory, the kind that other people carry with them when they leave the room. When we trace marriage all the way back, through courtrooms and churches, through property laws and inheritance codes, through alliance building and clan survival, what we find, underneath all of it, is something surprisingly consistent. People wanted their bonds to be real. They wanted them recognized. They wanted to say, in whatever language their culture offered, this person and I are connected, and that connection means something. The forms changed. The reasons changed. The power structures changed. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly. But the human impulse at the center of it never quite did. We formalized love not because love needed paperwork. We formalized it because we needed each other to know that we meant it. And perhaps that is the most honest thing history can tell us about marriage. It was never really about love in the beginning. It was about survival, property, power, order, all the things humans build when they are afraid of chaos. But somewhere along the long and complicated road from ancient alliance to modern ceremony, something shifted. The structure remained, but the meaning inside it changed. People began to use the old form to carry a new feeling, to say something that the feeling alone couldn't quite say. There is a quiet kind of beauty in that. If you look at it a certain way, that a system built for practicality was slowly, stubbornly filled with meaning by the people living inside it. That humans took something designed for survival and turned it, over centuries, into an expression of something far more tender. Marriage today is imperfect. It always has been. It will always carry traces of what it once was. The old structures, the old assumptions, the old imbalances. Those things do not disappear simply because we have changed the laws or updated the language. But it is also, now, in many parts of the world, a genuine choice. And a choice, freely made, is a different kind of thing entirely. It is a person saying, out of all the possible futures I could build, I want to build mine with you. Not because I have to, because I want to. That, perhaps, is where the long and hidden history of marriage has been quietly heading all along. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.